Okay, so this is a somewhat different format. I'm not going to use the board. Instead, I want to show you a few things on the screen. And we'll see how this format here via Zoom works in terms of recording lectures. What I'd like to talk about in this particular video is the different editions of the liturgical books that are available to you. And I'll start by talking about the liturgical books in Slavonic. And then I will also talk about the liturgical books that exist in English, and I will show you some of the books that are out there. And hopefully you will find this useful, and you will see that there are many different resources that exist for you in your Kleros practice. I'm going to focus exclusively on the books used on Kleros. I won't address the issue of the different books for the clergy, because that's another separate discussion. So let's actually talk about the Menea, and perhaps it will be only the Menea that I'll talk about in this video. We'll see how much time this will take up. In terms of the Slavonic editions of the Menean, there are two primary editions of the Menean in the Slavonic that you need to be aware of. And this issue is also important for you if you serve in English, and even if you don't read Slavonic, because the English books, as you will see, are derived from either the Slavonic or the Greek books. So this is an important issue for all of us. There are two editions of the Slavonic Menea. The first edition are the so-called brown Menea, so named after the color of their cover. And let me show you what these books look like. Let's see, I think this is done this way. Yes. Share. Now, can you see? Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry, this is the first time I'm doing this, so this is going to be a little bit slow at first. Okay, but now you cannot see this, I think. Okay, wait. It's a little bit frustrating because you have to do it like this. Okay, here we go. I think now you'll be able to see this. Okay, hopefully now you can see this. So this is a scan of the brown edition of the so-called brown Menean. They were printed back before the revolution in Kiev by the Lavra of the Kiev cave. So you see the date here is 1893. But these aren't the actual 1893 editions. These are reprints of the 1893 editions done recently in 1997 in Moscow by the Svetitsky Monastery. So the brown Menean is a reprint of the pre-revolutionary edition of the Menean. It comes in 12 volumes, right? One volume for each of the 12 months. And I forgot to mention that the term Menean comes from the Greek min, which means month. Literally it means monthly, the monthly book. The characteristic feature of this particular edition of the Slavonic Menean, besides the fact that its cover is brown, hence the name, is that this particular edition of the Menean, as you can see, is typeset in the Church Slavonic script. Now, I told you that these editions are reprints of the pre-revolutionary Menean, and that's in fact what is claimed here on the title page. But in fact, this is not exactly the case. These are not exact reprints of the pre-revolutionary edition. For one thing, references to the Tsar have been purged from this book. I won't go into finding examples for you, but you can do that if you compare the pre-revolutionary text with this text. And unfortunately, as is often the case, there is no indication anywhere of which texts were edited or by whom or how. But references to the Tsar have been removed. But that's probably not the most significant thing. The other significant thing about this is that there have, of course, been saints that have been canonized since the revolution and since these books were printed, and a small number of those services have been added to the appendix to this book. So there, if you look at these books, in the end here, following the 30th of September, there is also services for a number of newer services on the 4th for the icon of the Mother of God, the burning but unburning bush, and for St. Yosaf of Belgorod. So he was canonized after these editions of the Menean were printed. There's also a service for a recently canonized saint, Siloan of Athos, and so forth. So there are a few services to newly canonized saints that are printed in the appendix to this particular edition of the Menea. So those are the brown Menea. Let me close out of that. And okay. Now, the second edition of the Menean that exists in the Slavonic are the so-called green Menea. Before I show you the green Menean, let me tell you a little bit of the history of the green Menean and where they come from and what was the idea behind the concept of printing these books. Remember, I told you in one of the previous lectures that the principal idea behind the reforms undertaken in the Russian church in the second half of the 17th century under Patriarch Nikon, which we've called the Niconian reforms, was to get the Slavonic liturgical books to agree with the Greek liturgical books printed in Venice. And this was also true for the Menea. And between 1685 and 1691 in Moscow, the 12 volumes of the Menean were printed, a new edition that was corrected or revised on the basis of the Greek Menea printed in Venice. And one of the issues that took place there is that most of the services to Russian saints, and there had been a large number of Russian saints that were glorified at the different councils in the Russian church in the second half of the 16th and early 17th century. Many of those services to the Russian saints were removed from the Menean. And the reason for that is that it was very simple. Of course, they're not in the Greek editions of the Menean printed in Venice because they're composed originally in the Church Slavonic language. And the fact that many of the services to the Russian saints were removed from the Menean is problematic. And it has led to the fact that usually only in most of our churches we serve for the first saint whose name is printed in the calendar, which is the ancient saint, the ecumenical saint, the saint of the ancient church. And the other saints that are printed in whose memory is printed in the calendar, oftentimes no one serves for them, even though there are services for them, because those services are not available in the standard editions of the Menean, in the brown Menean. And one of the desires of the All-Russian Council of 1917-1918 was to reactivate the tradition of serving to the saints of the Russian church, the local saints. And to that end, to put together a new compendium of services of the Menean that would contain all of the services for the Russian saints and many services to other saints, including Serbian and Bulgarian saints, other services that were composed originally in the Slavonic that were not available in the standard Menean at that time. So that was the idea put forward by the All-Russian Council of 1917-1918. Unfortunately, that idea was not realized at the time because the events of the Russian Civil War and the persecution of the church by the communist government were not conducive to such a major undertaking. However, there was an enthusiast among one of the members of the council, a wonderful person who is now a canonized saint, Saint Afanasy Sakharov, Bishop of Kovrov, who spent many years in the Soviet concentration camps as a prisoner of conscience and who's been canonized as a confessor. He was a liturgist, and he was a member of the council then as a higher monk, and he went through with a project to collect as many of the services to the Russian saints that he could get a hold of. He took the text of the services from the pre-Niconian editions of the Menean, as well as from various services that people sent him and from manuscripts that he had access to, and he collected all of these materials. And he reposed in the 60s, but in the 1970s, when the Moscow Patriarchate received the permission from the communist government to finally reopen its publications arm and its printing house, the Moscow Patriarchate organized a commission that went through all of the materials that remained after from Saint Athanasius, Bishop of Kovrov, and various other materials that were available to them, and to compile all of these things and put forward a new edition of the Menea. And the result of this are these so-called green Menea, called green because their cover is green. And let me show you the September volume of the green Menea. Now, the green Menean is available in 24 volumes because it has more text than the brown Menean. It's not necessarily 2 volumes per month. Some of the months like September and October are one thick volume, but a few of the months like May and June have 3 volumes, and I'm not really sure why that's the case. I think that just has to do with some editorial practices in the Moscow Patriarchate's printing arm. So here is the September volume of the Green Menaion, okay, and they were reprinted. So they were first printed in the early 80s under still Patriarch Pimen, and then they were recently reprinted in the early 2000s. You see here 2003. Basically word for word. There were a few typos that were corrected, but these are basically identical to the ones printed under Patriarch Pimen. So the characteristic feature of these books, unlike the Brown Manet, is, as you can see, that they're typeset in the Sybil or Russian script. This is not Russian, this is still Church Slavonic, but it's typeset in the Russian script. Now, this is not some kind of a massive modernist, renovationist project to get rid of Church Slavonic, like somebody told me once. This is a very simple reason why it's done this way. It has to do with the fact that in the 80s, when this was first printed, the Moscow Patriarchate Publications arm did not have the technical means to print Church Slavonic text. And so they had to print it like this. I'm told by some colleagues in Moscow that, there is now a project to retypeset these in the Church Slavonic script, and hopefully that will be done. Maybe not. I prefer the Church Slavonic script myself, but well, anyway, that's a different story. So if you take a look here, for example, September 9th, there's the standard service for Joachim and Anna that is found in the Brown Menaion. But then there is also another service for our father, Venerable Father Joseph of the Voloklamsky Monastery. And it's set up as an all-night vigil. So there's little vespers, great vespers, and so forth. And there should be another service here for Saint Theodosius, Archbishop of Chernigov, also set up as a vigil. And there's another service after that. I won't spend time showing you that. So there are many more options for you in this book. You can choose which of these saints to serve for. And there are many texts. So some of the services have been expanded to be vigil rank. So there's more text that you can use if you want to serve like the Polyeleus. The other nice feature of these books is that they include for every service a life of the saint. So you see here a short life of Saint Joseph of Volokolamsk, which you can either read in your own devotions, or you can read, for example, during clergy communion in church. They also include a proof for an icon. More of an interest to iconographers who want to see how to make an icon, how to create an icon of the saint. And they also include this. We can probably find this, for example, in the service for Saint Theodosius of Chernigov. It should include also. Oh, it's not in here. Nuts. Okay, well, oftentimes for many of the saints, they also include a prayer addressed to that saint. Okay, and it's typically printed at the end of the text, following the text for liturgy. That can be very useful for you, because both in your personal devotions, if you want to pray, but also in church. So here, for example, in the service for St. Joseph Volokolamsk, it says see October 18th for the prayer. Okay, so they didn't reprint it. But in many of those cases, just trust me, in many of the cases, it includes the prayer. That's useful if you ever want to serve a Malaban. And it's also useful, for example, if you're serving a Polyeleus and you have the traditions very common in Russia, less common in the diaspora. At the end of the liturgy, the clergy come out and you sing the Troparion, Kondakin for the saint, and then you can read the prayer to the saint there. It's like a mini Malaban. So that's also quite useful. There's a separate book that has prayers that can be used for Malabans, but that's a separate thing you have to get. So that's the Green Menaion. Now, the Green Menaion, so let me close out of that. The Green Menaion is going to have many more texts for you if you serve in Slavonic than the Brown Menaion, but it still is not going to have the text for the various saints that were glorified by the Russian church after those editions were printed. And remember that at its council for the millennium of the baptism of Russia in 1988, the Moscow Patriarchate canonized quite a few saints, like St. Theophan the Recluse, St. Ignatius Brinchinina, St. Xenia of St. Petersburg. And then at its Jubilee Council in 2000, the Russian Church also canonized a large number of saints and, most importantly, the new martyrs of Russia. So any of the liturgical texts for those saints are not going to be included in this 24-volume collection because they were composed later. Now, in addition, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia canonized a number of saints and also has services that its composers put together, and those obviously are not going to be here. I'll talk about those separately. So for those additional services for the newly canonized saints, there's a separate volume, and that separate volume is called the Minea Дополнительная, the Supplemental Menaean. And the Supplemental Menaean, originally was printed as also a book with a green cover that was set in the Civil or Russian script, but still in Church Slavonic, and that had the services for some of these newly canonized saints, like St. Theophan the Recluse and others. But recently, the Moscow Patriarchate Printing House produced a new edition of the Supplemental Menaeans. This is very new. That has this blue cover, Minea Дополнительная, Part 1 from September to February. And this particular very nice edition, see, this is 2018. This is very fresh. This particular service book is set in the Church Slavonic script, and it has many more services. So if we look at the table of contents here for a second, you'll see that for September, there is a service for the icon of God, Chernigov Gethsemane. There's a service for all of the saints who shone forth in Lipetsk. There's a service for our Venerable Father Siluan of Athos. There's a service for our Venerable Father Ilarion of Optina, one of the Optina elders, and so forth. Patriarch Tikhon, Higher Martyr Peter, Metropolitan Krutitsa, another new martyr, and so forth. So there are many new services here. This is a very handy book to have, and it's very beautifully done. They've done a really good job in terms of the typesetting and the decoration of this book. Very nice when they do that. Okay, so let's close out of that. So that takes care of the supplemental Menaean and the two editions of the monthly Menaean. Okay, now there are, if you open up the liturgical calendar, you'll see that for any given day, there are many saints listed there. And so what to do, if you want to serve for one of the saints listed in the calendar, either in church or in your personal devotions, but you looked in the brown Menaean and there's no service there. You looked in the green Menaean, there's no service there. You looked in the supplemental Menaean and there's no service there either. We have many more saints than we have services, and for a lot of saints, there are no services. And the other book that exists that you can use is the general Menaean, Общая Menaea. So let me show you that. What the general Menaean is a book that contains general fill-in-the-blank services for different categories of saints. So here there is a general service for Feasts of the Lord, general service for Feasts of the Theotokos, general service for Feasts of the Cross. Okay, there's general service for apostles, a hierarch and hierarchs, monastic father, many monastic fathers, a martyr, many martyrs, and so forth. So these texts have these services have text, and then it'll say imerek, which means insert name here, and there you have to put the name of the saint for whom you are serving. Let me see if I can show you an example of that. So see here you have a stikiron, and it says imerek, which means insert name here. So now you have to, if you're serving in Slavonic, you have to be a little bit careful because, of course, Slavonic is an inflected language. So you have to think ahead of time into which case you have to put the name. It's not always the vocative case, okay? If your Slavonic is not good, it might be a good idea to look through the text of the service ahead of time and pencil in the name in the right case, unless your Slavonic is good enough where you can do that on the fly. This book, the General Menaean, was very widely used in the Russian church for centuries, because a full set of the Menae, of the 12 monthly Menaean, especially in the era of manuscripts, was very expensive, and it's still very expensive. But it was prohibitively expensive in the era of manuscripts. And so only the rich monasteries and the big cathedrals had a whole set of the Menaean. And even when books were printed, came to be printed, many of the village churches didn't have a full 12-volume set. And if you don't serve daily services, you don't necessarily need the full 12-volume set of the Menaean. So this General Menaean was a book that was used very widely. Nowadays, in the era of the internet, where all of these books and all of these texts are basically freely available on the web, this is not as relevant a point. So you might say, okay, I'll probably never use the General Menaean, but there is still a reason why this particular book is useful, besides the fact that there perhaps may be a saint in the calendar for whom you want to serve, but for whom there is no service, so you open up the General Menaean. There is also the case of where you want to serve for a particular saint, and you want to serve a higher ranked service than what's given in the Typicon. So for example, today in the calendar, we have Saint Dorotheus, Bishop of Tyre, right? And the service is set up in the Menaean as a simple service. There's 3 stichira and a canon. But what if I want to serve for some reason a polyeleos for Saint Dorotheus? There may be valid reasons to do that, and I'll have you work through some of those examples in the homework assignments. The way that you're going to do that, you're going to need to supplement the service to the saint from text in the General Menaean. So you're going to have to open up the General Menaean, find the correct category of saint, and take the additional text that you need to do a polyeleos from the General Menaean. Okay, so the General Menaean is still quite useful, a resource to have. So that's the General Menaean. Okay, there is also the case of the new martyrs that the Russian church has glorified. At its Jubilee Council in 2000, the Russian church glorified over 1,000 new martyrs, and the glorification of the new martyrs has continued. And there are many, many, many new martyrs of Russia that are glorified in the calendar, and only a very small number of them have their own services that have been composed and approved for church use. The more famous ones, like Patriarch Tikhon, like Metropolitan Peter of Krutitsa, like Metropolitan Vladimir of Kiev. The lesser known ones, for a variety of reasons, don't have services that are printed in the Menaean. What to do if you want to serve for one of these new martyrs? The Moscow Patriarchate Publishing House has produced another very useful book that I will show you for this particular purpose. This is the General Menaean for the new martyrs and confessors of Russia. So it is also a General Menaean. So it has general fill-in-the-blank services, okay? But these general fill-in-the-blank services, sorry, this is a little bit slow because my computer's trying to do multiple things at once. These general fill-in-the-blank services are more appropriate to the events of the 20th century than the services in the General Menaean, because they don't talk about, you know, the Roman circus and the saint being thrown to the lions and things like that. They talk about the communist oppression in Russia and how the saint witnessed to the truth of the Christian faith in the face of the godless authorities. So here it is, the General Menaean for the new martyrs and confessors of Russia. This is printed in 2012, and it has these general fill-in-the-blank services. First, it has the service for the new martyrs and confessors of Russia. So that's that general service that's served on their synaxis. This is the Moscow Patriarchate version of the service, not the Rogor version of the service. And then it has, for example, a general service to a higher martyr of the 20th century. So this is a saint who was a bishop or a priest and was skilled for the faith. And it also has the text, and here it's got Imerek, right? So you have to put the name. So if you serve for the new martyrs, this is something that's going to come in handy. Here at the Theological Academy in St. Petersburg, we have a project that we started with a friend of mine a few years ago, and the bishop has been very supportive of this, and he gave us the blessing to serve for all of the saints who are connected to the seminary in some way. So they studied here or they taught here. And there's about 68 of them in total, and about 55 or so of them are new martyrs of the 20th century. So for each one of them, we serve in our academic chapel. And so we use this set of texts quite often. Okay, so that's the general Menaion for the new martyrs of Russia. So these are all printed books. So you're going to have to get these in Russia if you serve in Slavonic. Although a large number of them have been scanned and uploaded to the internet. If you can't find it on the internet, send me an email. I'll send you what I've got. But a lot of these texts have been digitized as well. So let me show you that. Now, by digitized, I mean not just scanned, but rendered in text format, which is very useful because you can copy and paste and edit and do other things. The project of scanning and running through OCR, optical character recognition, and then formatting these texts was started in the late 90s, early 2000s, and led to the creation of this website, Biblioteka Svetotechniской Literatury, orthlib.ru, which has all of the liturgical texts in Slavonic on it. And these liturgical texts are rendered in an obscure format that you're not going to be able to read, called HIP, because this was done back in the day before there was valid support for Church Slavonic and Unicode. So this isn't particularly useful, but this is where it all comes from. And the edition of the Menaion that they have here is the brown Menaion. It says as much here. They don't have the green Menaion here. Subsequently, Church Slavonic was encoded in Unicode, and so a more convenient way of working with these texts has been created. And so now you can find on the internet, on various websites, a Church Slavonic text of all of these books in text format. And all of these texts that are out on the internet are all derived from this orthlib.ru website, which is why I'm showing you that, so you're aware of where it all comes from. So there are typos in the texts. That all comes from the orthlib website. So on my website, ponemar.net, there's a section, Library of Liturgical Texts. This has the orthlib texts that are now encoded in Unicode, so they can be used quite easily, right? It just opens up here, and you've got the Slavonic text, and you can, if you need to, you can copy, paste, and whatever you need to do, and you can print. And there's other websites that have basically the same thing as well. That are derived from orthlib or from this Ponemar website, because we were among the first to get Church Slavonic supported in Unicode, so that's why that's there. So most of these texts are available on the internet in text-only format that you can use. Now right, so those new texts that are in the supplemental Menaion. So the orthlib text and all texts derived from orthlib, like ponemar.net, they have the brown Menaion. The green Menaion has recently also been digitized by a separate project. So let me open that up for you. That's on this website, Azbuka Viery. They have both the scans in a PDF format, and they have a digitized text. Now, of course, remember, this is in Russian script and not Slavonic script, the green Menaion. So this has the entire green Menaion. The only thing you have to worry about these websites, to a lesser extent, the text on ponemar.net, because these have gone through several iterations of people looking at them and editing them, although you can still find typos here. But these texts on the Azbuka website, because they're relatively new, they've just only recently been digitized, there can be OCR errors and typos in these texts. So if your Slavonic is good, you can probably fix those on the fly. But if your Slavonic is not that good, it may be a good idea to read these texts ahead of time and make sure you catch and correct any errors. they're usually just minor typos or problems with the stress that have occurred because of the process of digitizing. It's a monumental task to proofread all of this. And so errors are inevitable. Now, finally, the supplemental Manan and the new Manan for the general Manan for the new martyrs, those texts are available as well, even if you don't have the books. The Moscow Patriarchate's publishing house runs this website, Новые Bogoslužebные Teksты, nbt.rop.ru. And this website has all of the texts, I think all, and maybe even more than what is available in the supplemental Manan and in the new Manan for the new martyrs, right? So you can here click and you get texts, and this is all up there for you, free of charge on the internet. So there's really no reason now not to serve, every day for all of these saints. So my goal is for you to go back to your parish and to say, Father, we should have daily services with vigil all the time for all these new saints, because there are all these cool texts that we can use. Okay, let me get out of here. Okay, so I think I've talked about all of the Slavonic. Oh yes, okay, so there's one more issue with Slavonic. So the texts that were composed within the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia and are used in the diaspora, those texts unfortunately are not part of these compendia that are produced by the Moscow Patriarchate. They circulated in little booklets that were printed by the Holy Trinity Press in Jordanville, and most of those are out of print. And despite the fact that I've addressed this several times to folks in Jordanville, nobody has bothered to scan them and put them up on Jordanville's website, so it's quite difficult to get a hold of them. Thankfully, a group of schismatics out in Ukraine did that, and they scanned these texts and they put them on their website. So you can get at least some of these texts now. That's in this website, synod.ruschurchabroad.org. It's one of these Rokor fragment schismatic groups that operates out of Ukraine. And they've scanned, and you can see the service for St. Ksenia of St. Petersburg, the New Martyrs of Russia, St. Herman of Alaska, the Elders of Optina, and so forth. These are the services that were composed in Rokor. Generally, I like these services more than the Moscow Patriarchate services. They tend to be more better poetically developed and so forth. Those are not the only services that were composed within Rokor. There are many others that exist. I have them, but I don't have the time, unfortunately, to put them up all on the internet. Maybe someday I'll do that project. But if you're interested, write to me. I'll send them to you if you serve in Slavonic. Okay, so I think I have addressed the Slavonic issues. The final maybe thing to show you is there are other services out there, because there are many saints, and there are saints who are being glorified all the time, and there are services that are being written all the time for the different saints that we have in the calendar. And there's this website here. It's very poorly designed, but well, what can you do? It's on this LiveJournal blog, so you have to deal with all these ads and stuff. Frustrating. It's run by Father Maxim Plakin out in, I think he's in Voronezh. So he collects liturgical texts, and people write a lot of liturgical texts. And basically, if he gets a hold of it, as long as the author doesn't, put his copyright all over it, he puts it up on this website. So there's all sorts of texts here for all sorts of saints, new martyrs, various Russian saints, and they're just here, okay? And this website is impossible to navigate because it's not really a website, it's a blog, and everything just sort of sits there, and you've got to deal with the ads and stuff. But if you can navigate this website, there's a lot of jewels here. Now, a word of caution: the texts here are not approved for liturgical use by the Synod Liturgical Commission or by any valid church authority. And the people who write these texts oftentimes are amateurs. So these texts have very broad range of quality, from things that are really nice, that really, I mean, there's no reason why it couldn't be approved by the bishops for use, to things that are riddled with errors in Church Slavonic. So you have to be very cautious. I really only recommend doing this for your own personal devotions. Although if your bishop blesses, here the bishop has blessed us because we serve for all of our saints. If there is a service for one of our saints that hasn't been officially approved by the synod, if it exists on the internet, one of us who teaches Church Slavonic, either myself or one of the other instructors, has to download it, sit through it, make sure there's no errors in the language, make sure there's no doctrinal errors in it. And if we think it's okay, he's given us the blessing to serve it, but only limited to our academy. So if your bishop blesses something like that, you could use it in church as well. But really, for your personal devotion, there's no reason why you couldn't do these. But just be careful. The quality of some of these things is strange. And Father Maxime, he just collects them. He does not have the time to edit all of these things and make sure that they're okay for consumption. So I think I have really exhausted the topic of Church Slavonic, Menaion, the Church Slavonic liturgical text. I've addressed everything that there is to address. So let's talk about English, okay? Let's talk about English. If you serve in English, there are also two editions of the Menaion in English. One of the editions of the Menaion that exists in English is the edition of the Menaion that's produced by, that was translated by then Brother Isaac, who was later known as Father Joseph Lambertson. And it comes in this green cover, and it's printed by St. John of Kronstadt Press. I'm sorry, somebody's calling me. Okay, it's printed by St. John of Kronstadt Press, and it has this green cover. It's right here. Okay, and this is translated by Isaac Lambertson. Now, this text was translated from Slavonic. So this book has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of the Menaion that is done by Father Joseph Lambertson is that it was translated from Slavonic. So there's, generally speaking, a one-to-one correspondence between this English book and the Menaion in Slavonic, which is really helpful for you if you are in a bilingual setting where you like to serve in both languages. Now you're going to ask, right, if you've been listening to this lecture, well, which edition of the Menaion did Lambertson use? And the answer to that is that, as far as I can tell, he used the Brown Menaion, so the pre-revolutionary edition of the Menaion, and he translated those texts into English. Now, I say that as far as I can tell because I have not personally gone through and checked. And I know that there are a few services in this edition of the Menaion that are not in the Slavonic Brown Menaion, that he must have gotten from other sources. And I don't exactly know what those sources are. Maybe one of the pastoral school students, if you're looking for a senior thesis topic, this could be a really good topic. It's a little difficult, but it's doable to figure out what the sources for this Menaion is. So the advantage of this, again, is this agrees with the Brown Menaion in Slavonic. And if you're in a bilingual setting, for example, that's going to be helpful that you have the same stichira and the same canons, both in the Slavonic and the English. The disadvantage of this book is that it is translated from the Slavonic, okay? The majority of the texts in the Menaion, with the exception of the text for the Russian saints, were composed originally in the Greek. And so really you need to translate them from the Greek and not from the Slavonic. Any kind of textual problems that exist in the Slavonic, translation errors that exist in the Slavonic, and unfortunately there are quite a few of those, the Slavonic texts are not perfect, have been replicated by Lambertson into the English. And so this English text is going to have all of the faults of the Slavonic text, plus a few more. I also don't really like the language. To me, it reads like Slavonic with English words, but that's maybe more of a personal preference. It's easy to criticize. It's very difficult to do this, right? Father Joseph's, this is a labor of love, and he translated the entire Menaion and many more things, which is a monumental task. Now, this is The problem with English is that English books are copyrighted, which I think is an abomination. I think liturgical books should not be copyrighted, especially because this is not copyrighted by Lambertson. It's copyrighted by Gregory Williams, who then went into schism and took all of this with him into schism. And so if you want to get this, you're going to have to pay the schismatic organization $110 a volume, which is just ridiculous. Now, I have access to not scans, but typeset versions of these texts that I have put up on my website on ponemar.net in the section liturgical text in English. And some of these are PDFs. And in a few cases, I've started to put up the HTML. So here, for example, is the Menaean for July. And here we have all of the texts, right? And they're just, again, like the Slavonic, you can copy, paste, and use this. And that's great. That's great that that's available. The only thing is, I don't serve in English myself, and it would be a very big job that I have not done. I have not verified this text against what's in the printed editions of the Menaean. And so if someone can do that, that would be wonderful. I don't know to what extent it corresponds with the latest edition of the Menaean printed by SJKP. And I don't know to what extent it's free of typos and other errors. So that's the translation of the Menaean from the Slavonic. Now, if you serve in English, in addition to the SJKP Menaean that I've just shown you, there is another edition of the Menaean. And this is the edition of the Menaean that's translated by Holy Transfiguration Monastery out in Brookline, Massachusetts. This is another schismatic organization, unfortunately. I think they're part of Hakna. So this is what this volume looks like. I don't have access to these books. This is just a preview, okay? And the advantage of this set of the Menaean is that it's translated from the Greek. So it will be textually better than the translation of the Menaean by Lambertson. The disadvantage of this book is that it's translated from the Greek. So it is not going to agree with the Slavonic Menaean, okay? There will be different stichera and different canons on many occasions. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, didn't you just tell us a few minutes ago that at the end of the 17th century, following the reforms of Patriarch Nikon, the Russians corrected their Menaean on the basis of the Greek editions printed in Venice? That's absolutely true. But the problem for us is that the Greeks had a liturgical reform in the second half of the 19th century. One of the principal movers in this liturgical reform was an Athonite monk by the name of Bartholomew of Kutlumuseu, who worked on creating a new edition of the Greek Menaean. And the Menaea that were printed following the reform work of Bartholomew of Kutlumuseu are different textually from the Menaea printed in Venice that the Niconian scribes were using. Okay, they oftentimes have different stichera and they have different canons. We don't know exactly what sources Bartholomew of Kutlumuseu used, because as far as I know from the literature, this topic has not been studied. But I presume that he used some kind of Athonite manuscripts since he was working on Mount Athos. So it isn't a case of better or worse, or perhaps even the Greek text perhaps maybe even better because they use an older set of manuscripts in the Venetian edition. I don't know. I haven't compared this. I haven't studied it. The only thing I can tell you is that the Greek Menaea, the modern Greek Menaea, are different from the modern Slavonic Menaea. Correspondingly, this English edition, done by Holy Transfiguration Monastery, is going to differ from the Lambertson text. Okay. This edition is also metered for Byzantine chant. So it's got these stars that's metered for Byzantine chant, which is really convenient if you do Byzantine chant. But if you don't do Byzantine chant, it's kind of annoying. So if you want to get these, I do not have them scanned. I do not have those texts, and I don't want to go down that route because Holy Transfiguration Monastery and Hakna in general are even more aggressive about their copyright than everybody else, and they've taken people to court. So if you want to get these, you can pay $1,200 to this schismatic organization out in Boston and get this text. Okay, but it's a very nice edition. What else did I want to tell you? Oh, about meter. The Slavonic texts are, since we're on the topic of meter, the Slavonic texts are metered as well. And if you look at the Slavonic Menaion, they are metered. And this is maybe something I should point out to you, because I think few people realize this when they use the Slavonic texts. Let me open something up. Where can I open here? I'll open up the green Menaion for you for a second. Bear with me a second here. So if you take a look at this, this is if you serve in Slavonic. So this is the green Menaion. So you see the Slavonic texts are metered. They have these slashes. So what a lot of people don't realize is, you see here it says tone 5, and then it says Podobin, melody, Pripodobny Ochi, Venerable Father. So the text is metered in order to be sung to that melody, Pripodobny Ochi. It's not metered to be sung in tone 5, the standard obihad melody of tone 5. Now, generally speaking, this is not going to be a problem, okay? But in some of the Podobny that have the short melodic lines, like Domi Yefrafov and a couple of others, it will become inconvenient if you try to sing that not to the melody, the automelon melody, but instead to the dummy melody of tone 2. You're going to run into the problem of certain lines as they're metered in the Menaion being too short or maybe too long. So if you are serving in Slavonic and you're using these texts, you should be aware of the fact that this meter is guiding you in singing these texts to the automelon melody when there's an automelon indicated. And if you're not singing them to the automelon melody, you really ought to look through the text and re-meter it ahead of time. So the meter can be both good and it can be in the way of things. There, in addition to the two editions of the English Menaion that I told you about, so the SJKB edition by Lambertson and the Holy Transfiguration Monastery edition translated from Greek, there are two other English books that you need to be aware of. One is a very practical thing to have in your church if you don't serve every day, which is probably the majority of our parishes in the diaspora. And that's the Feasto Menaion, okay? The Feasto Menaion contains the services for just the major feasts, okay? The 12 great feasts and maybe a few other things. And this is the edition of the Feasto Menaion that was translated by Mother Mary out in the monastery in Bussy-en-Othe in France. And now Metropolitan, then still Archimandrite Callistos Ware, who of course is in Oxford. By far, hands down, this edition of the Menaion, which is unfortunately only the Feasto Menaion, and the corresponding volume with this, which is the Lenten Triodion, that was also done by Metropolitan Callistos Ware and Mother Mary. By far, hands down, this is the best English text because these two people, their Greek is impeccable, and Metropolitan Callistos is an Oxford scholar, and his English is very good. So this, in my opinion, is the best English text, and I don't know why no one has ever suggested to Metropolitan Callistos, at least when he was a little younger, to do more liturgical translations, because the language of the Lenten Triodion and the language of this Feasto Menaion is just miles better than what's in the Lambertson edition, and it's free of many of those translation errors. Now, I haven't spent much time with the Holy Transfiguration edition, so I can't comment on this. Again, some of this is personal opinion. Feel free to disagree with me. There are people who like the text in the Lambertson edition, and again, with deference to Father Joseph, it is a monumental task that he undertook, and criticizing is always the easiest thing to do in these cases. The final thing to show you is that there is a general Menaion that's available in English. This general Menaion that's available in English was translated back a very long time ago at the beginning of the 20th century by Nicholas Orlov, who was the Russian ambassador in London. The English text is just absolutely terrible. I mean, it's English; it's grammatically correct, but you know, it's not good. But okay, I mean, that's the general Manan that you have in English. This isn't a new edition. I don't exactly know what this is. This circulates on the internet. Somebody put this together from the old Orloff texts. They've retyped this. They even put an ISBN. Oh, here, John A. Peck. They even put an ISBN on here. So I guess this, you can find it somewhere. I don't know if it's available for sale. It's been circulating on the internet. Somebody copyrighted it, unfortunately, again. Um, you know, I don't know how you can copyright texts that are in the public domain. Maybe if somebody's a lawyer, they can explain that to me. But this is there also in the website for your use. This is, as far as I know, the only edition of the General Manan that's available in English. Okay, so I've addressed, I think, that. So maybe that's enough for today, and we'll stop the lesson with the Manan, and I won't talk about some of the other things. Maybe I'll talk about them later, or we'll discuss them in office hours. So hopefully that shows you what the resources that you have available to you. So we have the General Manan in English, we have the Feastal Manan in English, we have 2 editions of the Monthly Manan in English. So there's some options there for you just if you serve in English. And again, to recap, the SJKP edition of the English Manan corresponds with the Brown Manan in Slavonic, with a few additional texts. There is no exact correspondence with in the English to the Green Manan, which is probably not an issue for you if you're serving in English. You're probably not serving too many Russian saints. There is unfortunately no exact correspondence to the supplemental Manan for some of these new saints, and there's no exact correspondence to the General Manan for the new martyrs if you want to serve for the new martyrs. There are some additional texts that float out there on the internet on various websites. And there are some additional texts that were printed back in various booklets, both by Jordanville and by St. John of Kronstadt Press, and also, I believe, in the OCA, for various additional saints out there in English. As far as I can tell, there's no systematic approach where someone has sat down and figured out what texts are available in English. It would be nice for somebody to do that. Another idea for a senior thesis project, if somebody is a bibliophile type and wants to comb through the libraries and figure out what exists and what has been translated into English and is available in print, out of print, on the web. Has it been approved by the bishops and so forth? Can we use it in church? So that's that, and if you've got any questions, I'll try to address those in office hours. And okay, thank you for your attention. That wraps up this particular lecture.